introduce Dr. Mell, who has more of a life beyond just running M&M and the vascular surgery division. But I think all of you are, remember we had the privilege of recruiting Dr. Mell from Stanford almost 3 years ago now.
1.5. But thanks. I know it might feel that way.
The process started maybe 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's about right.
In any event, Dr. Mell has a really interesting history and pathway that brought him to where he is today, that is a reminder that none of our paths are necessarily, or few of our paths are straightforward. And the opportunities of serendipity and being open to new opportunities and ending up doing something you didn't expect you were going to do 20 years ago is a real option. And so without further ado, you're going to tell us most of the story, so I'll let you do that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, man.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by just letting you all know that the title of my talk, The Road Not Taken, is taken from a famous poem by Robert Frost. My mother, before she retired, was an English teacher, and she actually made all the students memorize the poem. I was not her student, but you know, I was subject to some of these things as well. So I'm actually going to share the poem with you as part of my talk. So, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. The reason why she chose this poem is that all of us have these moments in our lives where we have these forks in the road where we need to sort of make a decision and go one way. Everyone in this room has or will experience that, from medical students choosing to go into medicine and then having to choose a residency career, residents choosing a subspecialty, and then also choosing whether or not to go into an academic or a community practice. There's a lot of factors that influence these decisions, and what I really wanted to focus on with this talk through my challenging and circuitous pathway is the role of mentorship, because I think those who you are around can really influence you in many, many ways. I think it's important to realize that sometimes you get advice and information from unlikely sources. There's many definitions for mentor. I particularly like this one because it's concise. A mentor is someone whose hindsight can become your foresight. And interestingly enough, that's where I got this particular. So you never know where you're going to get great advice. Panda Express is one of my guilty pleasures, I'll admit it. So sometimes you just have to take what life gives you. You can still make the most of it, and you can still excel in whatever direction you may take, even if that direction changes over time. But it's important to realize that to succeed, you can't do it alone. So I'm going to start with my own background. So I am from the Bay Area. I went to Brown for college and Harvard for medical school. And it's interesting because there are studies that showed that up to 95% of medical students who are interested in surgery have identified a mentor as influential, and most of these students identified with residents over faculty. So these were my residents when I was a medical student. So for those of you who don't know who these are, this is Scott Adzik, who's now the chief surgeon at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. This is Dave Ratner, who was the chief of GI and general surgery at Mass General. This is Craig Lillehei, who's a pediatric surgeon at Boston Children's, and the son of Walter Lillehei, who many of you may have remembered hearing about in someone else's grand rounds. And this is Dave Torchiana, who's a cardiac surgeon and the former CEO of Partners, which is the merger between Mass General and Brigham and Women's. These were all my residents when I was a medical student. So now, of course, I had no idea that these people were going to, elevate to these roles. but it was obviously a phenomenal opportunity for me to be exposed to people who love the field of surgery. And actually, when I went into medical school, my original plan was to go into orthopedics, and for much of the influence through these people, I ended up choosing general surgery for my career. So I want to touch a little bit about the difference between a role model and a mentor. These people were really role models to me. They weren't mentors. So role models are people who we can identify with, who have qualities we would like to have, and they may be in positions we would like to reach. In the medical and in the surgical field, it mostly seems, studies have shown that it mostly seems to focus on teaching and clinical care, but there's no actual formal supervisory or advisory responsibility. And that compares with a mentor who, and this is another definition, we're going to get into some more definitions of mentorship. A mentor is an experienced, highly regarded, empathetic person who guides another, usually younger, individual in the development and reexamination of their own ideas, learning, and personal and professional development. Because of this complex role of a mentor, the mentor typically serves many different roles. They may be an advisor, a consultant, a friend, a teacher, a coach, and a leader. So for those of you who are residents in the room, it's important to realize that for the medical students and for each other, that you can really act as mentors. There have been studies in this, and what they showed is that for students expressing a positive view of surgery after a surgical rotation, nearly all of them had identified a role model or a mentor. And it turns out in these surveys that the residents actually outscored the attendings in terms of, in terms of the physician qualities, supervisor qualities, teaching, and personal qualities in the eyes of the students. Now, a lot of this is because the interaction is much more robust between the students and the residents. But I think it's important for residents to understand that you can really exert a significant influence in terms of forming their own personal and professional identity. And just as an aside, I would say that you can exert influence in both a positive and a negative way. So important to remember that we're highly influential people to our mentees or to our proteges. And so with that, I set off on a surgical career. I actually did my surgical residency at Stanford, and I did a transplant fellowship as well at Stanford. So at that time, it was a it was a transitional period. The chair of surgery had been asked to step down after my internship year, so there wasn't much organization and mentorship during that time. There was, however, for those who wanted to go into cardiac surgery, great mentorship. This is Norman Shumway. I hope all of you know who that is. I once asked people at Wisconsin, they weren't sure who that was. He did the first heart transplant in the United States. You don't know. This is Scott Mitchell and Craig Miller. These are both well-established, nationally recognized cardiac surgeons. And they provided great mentorship for those who were interested in cardiac surgery. But if you weren't interested in cardiac surgery, the mentorship was really scant at that time. This is Ron Dahlman. That's about what he looked like back in those days. Dr. Farmer and Dr. Jerkovich are nodding because Ron was actually a resident with Dr. Farmer and underneath Dr. Jerkovich when he was a junior attending at University of Washington. Ron actually joined the faculty when I was a chief resident. So from a mentorship standpoint, for me, it was sort of already a little too late to sort of and to focus on, to get some meaningful mentorship for him. But he more than made up with it later on. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So it turns out that 2/3 of in one study anyway, 2/3 of surgical trainees chose the same career as their mentor, and this was in part related to the mentor's skill, the mentor's achievements, and the mentor's verbal recommendations about their specialty field. In other words, they love their field and they really pass that love of their field along to their residents. And so this was my resident experience, and I will say that. And this is important for those of you who are looking for mentors, because to find them, you have to be willing to receive mentorship, and that really favors a prepared mind. And at the completion of residency for myself, I really was not at all prepared. In retrospect, I really recognize that. Now, there are some studies looking at barriers to receiving mentorship, and these are some of the more common reasons. Some residents never consider one, some don't understand how to find one, some don't recognize the benefits of having a mentor, and some just aren't able to communicate effectively with a mentor who they either have chosen or who has been chosen for them. And I just want to put this out here. This is Don Defoe. He's at, I think he's actually at UC Irvine now. He was the head of transplant at the time that I did my transplant fellowship. And we actually wrote a couple of papers, and he was the one who told me it's not always that fun writing, but it's really nice having written. And so this was actually the first paper describing CT for evaluating transplant renal artery stenosis, and then we followed this up with a first paper looking at CTA for evaluating donors for renal transplants, and that paper is actually is often quoted. But honestly, I had no idea where this could have left me, could have taken me. So we come to the second stanza. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. So this was a point in my life where I had to decide what to do, I think in part because of the lack of mentorship, and in part because of a variety of compelling personal reasons, decided to go down the community path. And I actually worked at Kaiser. So I actually worked in Kaiser in the East Bay for 12 years, a long time. I was there as a general and vascular surgeon. I was there as during the open era of vascular surgery, and so I had two vascular surgeons who took me under their wings. We did a lot of vascular surgery. I also had a complete general surgical practice as well. We got involved with EVARs way back in 2000. We put our first EVAR in 2000, right after they had become commercially available. And we actually developed an ancillary site for what was then the UC Davis East Bay program, and ultimately was transitioned to the UCSF East Bay program. And so we did have residents who came through. But by 2004, the field had really changed a great deal. It was, the endovascular treatment options were becoming more and more common, and people who actually were vascular fellowship trained in my era were all going back for mini fellowships to get trained. And since I was not a board certified vascular surgeon, I was not eligible for these mini fellowships. And I really thought about what I wanted to do. Should I just stay and do the general surgery that I was doing, or did I really want to continue to do vascular? And I really liked the vascular, and I didn't know really who to reach to. And I was fortunate because Alden Harkin was running the program, and I met him, and I went up to his office up in Oakland, and I asked him about this, and he looked at me and said, well, if you want to be vascular surgeon and you want to do a fellowship, you should just do a fellowship. And so I took his advice. It just so happened at that time, vascular fellowships were 1 year, and they had been transitioned through the ACGME to a 2-year fellowship, but there was a grace period. And so I kind of felt it was my little window to get in and do it in 1 year, because I've been doing vascular surgery for a decade. And so my original plan was to take a leave from Kaiser, which is what I did. I took a leave of absence, and I went to look for fellowships, and with the intention of coming back. And so that's what brought me to UW-Madison. So I was there as a fellow. While I was there, a few things happened. First of all, it was a beautiful campus. Actually, when I remember interviewing there, thinking, I'm from the Bay Area. Looking at Madison, I don't know if you've ever been to Madison. It's a beautiful little town, but it's a small Midwestern town when you come from a cosmopolitan area like the Bay Area. And I finished interviewing, and I thought to myself, can I really stay here for a whole year? And I said, yeah, I guess I could. And so I got there and worked with some great residents, one resident in particular, and really got re-exposed to an academic environment, and kind of realized how much I had missed by not being in an academic environment, and started thinking about, well, could I really do this? Now, mind you, most of my contemporaries were already reaching full professorship, who had gone the straight path to academics. And so I was very fortunate to have some great mentors. And Gurma Tefera was really my first mentor. So many of you may know Gurma because Gurma is very involved in ACS Global Health. But what you may not know is he's actually a vascular surgeon at University of Wisconsin. And so, so he really kind of took me under his tutelage and said, you know, you should do a paper while you're here and get something more out of your fellowship. He said, we can only teach you so much, but we can do this. And so I said, okay. So we decided we wanted to look a little bit about hypogastric artery coverage. And so we did the study, got it presented, and got it in print in that 11 months. Now, I wasn't exposed to academic practice, so I had no idea that that was a very fast track. And so, but we had success, and then from that, we started looking at some of the imaging because University of Wisconsin has a very close relationship with a lot of the GE technology, and so we were looking at MRI imaging of peripheral arterial disease, and it really got me excited about being in an academic career, and so I decided that I will, really turn around and take a detour and really a new path. I started looking for jobs, academic jobs, and just so happened that they wanted to hire me. They said, it's been a great year, and we'd love to keep you on. And I said, okay, well, I will. I was a single parent with he was a 10-year-old son at the time, and he really sort of fell in love with Madison, and so we ended up staying. I was fortunate to have other mentors within the group besides Gurma. C.W. Aker, who, if you've ever scrubbed with Dr. Rodriguez, you've heard about C.W. Aker. This is him, and this is Bill Turnipseed, who was the section chief at the time. And we looked at a variety of things over the next few years. We wrote up along with Mimi Wynn, who was actually Dr. Aker's wife and the anesthesiologist who really headed the spinal drainage program. Their experience of almost 500 patients with spinal drainage. We looked at some novel techniques for open thoracoabdominal aortic aneurysm repair, and then we looked at the use of balanced transfusions for ruptured aneurysms, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a few minutes. And so the question is, why did this mentorship? Why did it work? I mean, it didn't work for me before. Why did it work? And I think that it's really multifactorial, and much has been written about this. There's a lot of qualities that mentors have, and I was fortunate to have mentors who had these qualities. They were, I think experience, enthusiasm, persistence is very important. Many of you have hopefully realized that in an academic environment, persistence in the face of failure is a very, very important, and resilience is a very important skill set to have. They had a critical spirit in terms of how they mentored me, and mentors can identify strengths and weaknesses in their mentees and focus on the strengths and work on the weaknesses. For myself, I learned how to surround myself with these mentors by showing interest, concern, humility. It was, I think, very important. I'd come there with the 10 years of experience in vascular surgery, and I very purposefully went there with the approach that I'm there to learn as much as I can, not to let them know how much I've already, learned from my experience. I think that really, flowed over into this whole concept of mentorship. I learned how to be a better active listener, although some would say I still need to work on that. And became receptive to their feedback. Learned how to meet deadlines so we could move these process. I was dedicated to the process and was respectful and trusting because I had this great relationship with these people. And so I think it's important to know that one of the great values of mentorship is that it can help the mentees push their goals beyond what they thought was possible by encouraging them to take risks, learn from mistakes, and reevaluate failures as learning experiences. So I want to talk again about this particular paper. So we submitted this paper. This was a retrospective study. It was really the first study outside of the trauma literature to show that balanced transfusion can really improve survival for patients with massive blood loss. And we submitted this to Journal of Vascular Surgery, and unfortunately, at the time, there was a lot of publications regarding EVAR for ruptured aneurysms. So the journal they just weren't that interested in the paper, and so they rejected it with a number of comments, and really wasn't sure what to do with this. And I talked with Germa and with Bill Turnipseed, and they said, well, you know, this happens sometimes. Just address their comments and submit it somewhere else. So we submitted it to surgery, which at the time, and probably even still now, actually has a higher impact factor than Journal of Vascular Surgery. And I got this wonderful review that was actually, you know, with a cover letter that was written by Andy Warshaw, who was the editor-in-chief of the journal at the time, saying it's a great paper, you need to address these things. You'll turn this from a double into a grand slam or something like that. And it was very encouraging. And so we went ahead and made the changes. The paper got submitted. And I share the story with you for two reasons. Number one is that I was ready to, you know, to toss the papers, you know, and really learned that, you know, sometimes you just got to keep working, and the mentorship was extremely helpful in this. The other thing that was very interesting about this is now fast forward maybe seven years or so, and I had been invited to an international conference in Padua in Italy. And Martin Bjork, who's from Uppsala, Sweden, and who was at the time was the president-elect of the European Vascular Surgery Society, was there. And the two of us were introduced. And he was like, oh, I know all about your work. Your work is really phenomenal. It was seminal work. And by that, I published a fair amount by then. I wasn't actually sure what he was referring to. I'm like, oh, well, thank you so much. Which paper was the one you liked? And actually, this was the paper. And so you sort of never know where these things, and you know, Dr. Farmer mentioned a little bit about serendipity. There's definitely a lot of serendipity in these things, and so I share the story with you so that you understand how important the mentorship was to me. Now this led on to the next and probably one of the most important of my mentors. This is Maureen Smith. She's a health services researcher in the School of Public Health at University of Wisconsin. She's an MD, MPH, PhD, highly regarded researcher using Medicare data and on chronic disease. And I got very interested. Madison is very similar to Sacramento in that it's an urban area surrounded by a lot of rural area, and there's a lot of patients who live in rural areas who need to get their care. And I became very interested in sort of the potential disparities in treatment for abdominal aortic aneurysms between rural and urban areas. So I wanted to do the project. I came to her, and she's tough. She's had a lot of surgeons come to her who didn't really sort of follow up, and she ended up saying no to a lot of people. It took me about 3 months to convince her that I was really serious about doing this project. She finally agreed to be my mentor, and I worked with a couple of other physicians, a gerontologist and a rheumatologist, and we had actually a series of papers that we all authored together and worked together through this work group. And this was the paper that we actually did. And what we found, interestingly enough, was that the outcomes for rural patients when one looked at survival and readmissions was actually better. And a lot of this was because nearly all of the patients in rural areas were getting their aneurysm repairs in urban areas. So they were being referred. There was, in fact, a de facto regionalization. And this is important because this really sort of pointed me towards outcomes in health services and research and policy research. And at the end of these projects, she said, you know, you really need to get a master's degree. I'm like, what? She goes, yeah, you know, to really take the next step and to become a content expert, you need to get a master's. You need to have a more granular understanding for this kind of research. And when you have these meetings with those of us in the group, you need to understand when you're asking for something what's easy and what's hard. And so I sort of got it in my head to get a master's. And then we'll go back to the poem. And both that morning, these are both roads, both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I think the point of the stanza in this poem is that once you take that fork in the road, it leads you to a way you may never get back to that original fork. I was lucky though, because I did go back, and so I actually went. Not only did I go back to academics, I went back to Stanford. And so I came to Stanford in 2009. There were a number of factors that really influenced this decision. The first was personal. I married that really very interesting resident who I had met during fellowship. She's a trauma surgeon, and we were both looking for academic jobs. And it turned out that in the Bay Area, there were both opportunities. And professionally, when I spoke with Dr. Dahlman, who was to become one of my best and strongest mentors, he agreed to allow me to get a master's in health research and policy as part of my career development. So I came with the idea of being clinically active and doing my health outcomes research. I also, and this is a story for another day, but let's just say I got tagged for a variety of administrative opportunities, which ultimately led to being the medical director for specialty care for the entire Stanford Hospital institution, and ultimately to vice chair of clinical affairs in charge of quality, very similar to the role that Dr. Jerkovich has here. And so Dr. Dahlman, this is what he now looks like, closer to what he looks like today. We've all aged. I actually purposely didn't put any photos of myself from way back then, because I've changed a great deal too. Dr. Dahlman was and continues to be a great mentor for me. This is Lauren Baker, who's now the chair of health research and policy at School of Medicine, a member of the National Bureau of Economic Research. This is Mark Klatke, who's a cardiologist and a nationally renowned health outcomes researcher. This is Jay Bhattacharya, who's a health economist, also nationally recognized. These were all, these three were professors of mine during my master's, and they became partners and colleagues of mine. So the master's degree really helped catapult me in terms of my research. Another small vignette. So one of the courses I had to take was an undergraduate course in health economics. It was a requirement for the degree, and at the time, at least one, if maybe not both, of my kids were actually older than the undergrads that I was in the class. And so I was in the class, and Jay was the one who taught the class, and so he would be talking about all this theory, and then he would keep calling on me in the class. It was a class about twice as big as this class, and I would answer these questions, and at the end of at one of these lectures, I'm like, Jay, why do you keep calling on me? I said, I'm the old guy in the room. There's all these young people who are excited about this. And Jay's like, no, you're the doctor in the room. You're the one who makes all this stuff real. And so perhaps I was able to positively influence those in that room. I'll never know. So this really led me to a lot of the research that went from there on out. Now, when I talked with you 6 weeks ago about the abdominal aortic aneurysm screening and surveillance, and there's sort of another half of that. A lot of that research came out of my master's program, my thesis, and then thereafter. And this is sort of where I left off on the last talk. And this was, as we were looking at surveillance, we found that a third of patients with ruptured aneurysms had been diagnosed with an aneurysm for over 6 months. And so I just want to share a little bit about some of the research, and how this combined with mentorship really led me down the next 10 years. And so what we realized was that this gaps in surveillance was probably important for Ruptured. People have written a lot about surveillance, but there wasn't really much literature in gaps and how that was important. And so we did another study looking at Medicare data where we really focused specifically on gaps in surveillance, gaps as defined by the SVS guidelines, and we wanted to see how that impacted Rupture. And this was a retrospective study looking at aneurysm repairs. And what we found was that only about a little over 10% of patients who had intact repairs had a gap in their surveillance somewhere along their surveillance pathway, whereas nearly half of those with rupture had a gap, and most of those gaps were actually, not surprisingly, lost to follow-up. And when we did a multivariate analysis, what we found was that gaps was actually the strongest predictor of rupture, and with a nearly six-fold likelihood of rupture if there are gaps. And so I think that this is important in the United States because many aneurysms still, even with our quote surveillance programs, many aneurysms are found incidentally, and I think that those patients are at risk for not getting adequately surveyed. I think that's because the scan might have been done for some other reason. It may not have been done by the patient's primary care physician. There's a variety of reasons for this. And so, we've really focused a lot on the SVS guidelines. We'll talk about that in a minute, on surveillance for patients with known aneurysms. We also realized as we were going through this data that when patients rupture, the mortality is very high. A lot of that mortality is because they don't make it to an institution, but sometimes they don't make it to an institution that actually can offer repair. And so we really wanted to study that. And so this was a study that we did next, and we used the NEDS, which is a National Emergency Department sample. It's similar to the NIS, but for emergency rooms, and we wanted to look for predictors of emergency department death for patients who presented with ruptured aneurysms. What we found was that nearly 10% died in the emergency room, and another 6% were admitted, but they died without a procedure. We felt, and what was interesting to me was that here in the western region of the United States, it was far more common for this to happen. And we summarized this by realizing that the ED death really was a major contributor to abdominal aortic mortality when one looks at all-cause mortality, and there may be delays in providing definitive care, and we postulated that by improving regional systems, this may improve survival after ruptured aneurysms. Now, interestingly, with this data set, only about 4% of patients were transferred, and the way that this data set was constructed, once they were transferred, you couldn't follow them. And that didn't make sense to us, because it had been our experience, and granted, we were at a tertiary center, so we were a little biased in what we saw. We thought that the number of transferred patients should be higher. And so we actually wanted to study that a little more. And so we actually used a different data set. We actually used state inpatient databases from California, Florida, and New York. And we actually, through probabilistic matching, combined the inpatient and outpatient databases so we could do a continuum of care for these patients to really get a sense of what happened with these patients when they presented with a ruptured aneurysm. And our findings were a little different and a little more consistent with what we thought. First of all, we found that nearly 20% of patients with ruptured were transferred. And over the study period, which was 2005 to 2010, that number increased. Interestingly, and this has actually been quoted a fair number of times since this paper was published, 1 in 6 of these patients who were transferred died without receiving treatment. And this may have been because they just needed to get to someone who could make a decision. They may have died along the way, or they may have deteriorated during the transfer so that repair was futile by the time they got to the treating facility. And so we looked at this looking at both operative mortality and the overall mortality, and we found, not surprisingly, that for those who were able to receive an operation, they actually had a survival benefit. And I think that there's some patient selection here, because if they survived the transfer, they're more likely to get operated on. Whereas if one looked at the overall survival starting from their initial presentation, including all of those patients who got transferred and didn't get an operation, it was actually a higher overall mortality. And so our conclusions from this was that if, number one, to try and improve local care if that's possible and avoid the transfer. Number two is to only transfer patients who should be transferred to try and improve patient selection. And when you're going to transfer a patient, have systems and care so it's a rapid and efficient transfer so that they can get to the treating facility quickly and get treated quickly. And so we sort of talked about what we thought were some of the key components to successful transfers, and realized that there may not be a lot of consistency across the Western region. Remember, the Western region had higher ED deaths than the rest of the country, and a lot of this may be wide open spaces. And so we actually, through the Western Vascular Society, sent out a survey which we ultimately published, where we wanted to see how much consensus there was, and how vascular surgeons in the Western region managed ruptured aneurysms for transfer. And our society is about half academic and half community, just to sort of give community physicians, just to give you a sense of the physician cohort. And what we found was that and we wanted to use this as a reference point to develop some regional guidelines. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that there was some consensus for who should or shouldn't be transferred, but there was a lot of areas where there was no consensus. Excuse me. And so we realized that by reducing this variation and trying to reach consensus, we could hopefully improve the regional care. And so we developed, through Western Society, through this survey results, and using a modified Delphi approach, and literature review and guidelines from the existing societies in Europe, we actually developed and published Western Society guidelines. And just as an aside, I was the first author and corresponding author, but Dr. Pevic was actually the senior author of this at the time. So perhaps a harbinger of things to come without realizing it. And so this was adopted, and what this actually, and I'm going to get back now to my story of mentorship. So Ron Dahlman was not an author on this, but was obviously very engaged in the whole process. And Ron was a member of the Society of Vascular Surgery writing committee for the national guidelines, and he supported my joining that group when the revisions came out in 2017. And Ben Starnes, who's also listed in here somewhere, there he is at the end, was also part of that writing group. And so this was an opportunity for me to reach sort of a national stage. And this was all, I mean, obviously some of it was because of my work, and this is both in the screening and surveillance and in these, in the ruptured aneurysm work. But honestly, I mean, I had mentorship from Dr. Dahlman, and really sponsorship as well. He really sponsored my addition to the writing group, and a lot of this work ended up being included in the national guidelines. And so that was really very helpful for my career. And so I just want to talk a little bit about sponsorship. So we've talked about role models, we've talked about mentorship, and now we're going to talk a little bit about sponsorship. And I think that this is also important, and especially in an academic career, my message is that we, all of us, need all of these things, and it really actually never stops. So sponsorship is episodic, it's focused on specific opportunities. So for example, my being invited to join this writing group for our national society. Effective sponsors are career established, well-connected talent scouts. Effective proteges can rise to the task and remain loyal to their sponsors. A lot of these other characteristics are very similar to mentors, and in fact, there is a lot of overlap, and mentors can be sponsors, and sponsors can be mentors, and sometimes mentors turn into sponsors, and so on and so forth. And I think what's important is that it's a little more of a transactional relationship, the sponsorship part of that. It's typically episodic, and especially later in one's career, and I guess I'm reached that point where it's later in my career, it's become very important. And I've been very fortunate to have a number of sponsors over the last 5 or 6 years. And so some of these some of these you may not. This is Craig Kent, who's a vascular surgeon, who was the chair of surgery at Wisconsin when I was there. He's now the dean at Ohio State. Mary Hans, the chair at Stanford. Bing Rickers was the chair at Wisconsin. Herb Chan, who's the chair at UAB, and he was a surgeon at Wisconsin when I was at Wisconsin. You know Drs. Freischlag, Farmer, and Jerkovich, and this is John Harris, who's a vascular surgeon at Stanford, who's also continuing to support me. And these have really led for me to a lot of opportunities, whether it be writing editorials in Circulation or in Annals of Surgery, or really pushing and promoting me to become a division chief. And so that sort of leads me to here. And as I sort of look back on where I've gone so far, I realize how important all of these mentors, sponsors, role models have been for me. I'll be honest with you, when I joined academics, again, I was in my early 40s, and my goal was to become associate professor. I figured, I'm starting so late, if I can become associate professor, that's going to be great. And when I became an associate professor, I met with Ron, with Dominic. He says, okay, well, what's your next goal? I said, what do you mean my next goal? This was my goal. I wanted to be associate professor. He's like, no, you have to have more goals. And so he really pushed me to, to look at more. And so for me, I feel extremely fortunate because I've accomplished far more than I ever expected that I would. And as I've, for myself, transitioned from mentee to mentor to perhaps, a little bit now of sponsor, I just have to say how really gratifying it's been for me to make that transition, and how I look forward as I work with all of you here to pay it forward, all the great success that I've been able to achieve in a large part because of the support that I've had. I just want to mention a little bit about the rewards of mentoring. It was William Osler who said, no bubble is so iridescent or floats longer than that blown by the successful teacher. And really what this is referring to is how much joy we as teachers get to see the success of our pupils, mentees, and so forth. And there's a Hindu proverb that says, I have learned much from my teachers, more from my colleagues, and the most from my students. And for those of you who are mentees, students, residents, I want you to remember that the mentees are actually often the best teachers. We may not always acknowledge that, but we learn a great deal from all of you all the time. And I've been fortunate to have a great number of mentees. These are just a few of them, photos that I happen to have in my iPhone. There's many more that I can't put in here. And so I have a couple of final thoughts. The first is from James Comey, who, for those of you who don't know, is the FBI director who was fired about a year ago. And he was actually, I had the fortune of meeting him last month because he was a speaker at the Sacramento Speaker Series. He gave a talk, well, his talk was actually about ethical leadership. But it was really fascinating because it was really in many ways a talk on mentorship. And as I was talking about this lecture to my residents, it was actually Andrew Wishy who said, you were like at a master class for leadership. And it really was. I mean, you really can learn from listening to his experiences, both good and bad. And what he said is, there's a difference between management and leadership. He says, you manage work, you lead people. As a leader, and I think this goes for as mentor as well, you need to be tough and kind. You need to be confident and humble. He really valued the use of humor to flatten out the steep hierarchy that exists in many of our career workplaces. He says leaders let their people shine, and as a leader, you need to be very good. And when you listen, hear. I think those are great points, and I really have taken them to heart. The last comments were from our Western Vascular Surgery meeting last week. Tom Forbes is the Chief of Vascular at Toronto, former colleague of Bob Kiai at Hamilton, who will be will be coming here soon. And he gave the keynote speech at Western Vascular, and so I borrowed some of his comments. And These have to do about academic medicine and how to succeed. And, just to remind you that it's still about the patient, the patient, the patient, the patient. We're here to take care of patients. As an academician, be inquisitive because the truth is out there. Find mentors and work with them, utilize. And, it's okay to be lucky. So with the final stanza of Robert Frost's poem, I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, his meaning for this was he took the road less traveled, but he always wondered what would have happened if he had taken the other road. I feel very fortunate because somehow, some way, I managed to take both roads, and I think that I'm better for it. And in that sense, I actually followed the advice of Yogi Berra, the immortal baseball player, who said, "When you come to a fork in the road, take it." So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Matt, it's just been such a pleasure to have you join us, and we're glad you took the forks in the road. And I really do think that the perspective of having spent, and we have others in our faculty who have similar kinds of stories, spent some time in the Kaiser and the private life and some time in academics, and I think we come back because there's almost nothing better than the privilege of being able to provide patient care, to teach, and to ask questions. That's really the privilege of being an academic surgeon. So thank you for sharing that in such a personal way.
Oh, my pleasure.
Anybody want to ask Dr. Mell one of those probing questions?
Dr. Wishy.
So you've had mentors in the past ask you, so now you've reached this goal, what's next? What is next?
For me?
Yep.
Well, I'm still trying to make this one work. So I will say, so I spoke with Bing Rickers, as I was looking for division chief jobs, and so Bing was the department chair at Wisconsin for, 10 or 15 years. And before that, he was the department chair at Nebraska for 10 or 15 years. He was just a phenomenal leader. He gives a great leadership talk periodically, and if you can, he actually gave a grand rounds at Stanford, so on leadership. So if you want to see his talk, you can probably pull it up on YouTube. And when I talked to him about this, he said, he spent almost his whole career as a department chair. He says, the best job I ever had was as a division chief. And so, and I've heard that from a number of department chairs. So I'm very content with what I'm doing right now. I was actually just named in an executive position in Western Vascular, so I'll have an opportunity to make some leadership opportunities in some of our societies. I look forward to that. And in terms of my role here, we'll see where it goes. I think a lot of this is just by chance. Sometimes you have to sort of pay attention to what's going on you and find a chance that looks appealing to you and take it. And sometimes, I will be perfectly honest with you, it requires a little bit of a leap of faith. So, Bob?
Yeah, I just have one question. Did you get married in a parking lot?
Yeah, so my wife is actually in the room, so I need to be careful how I respond to that. So we actually got married. We got married in San Francisco, and we decided we wanted to take some photos around the city. So we had a reception between our wedding and the reception. We had a cocktail hour for all of the guests, and we took off with the photographer around the city and took some photos. And so that was actually at the Ferry Building, although it did look like a parking lot from that.
So, very accomplished videography. One of the things you in your opinion, strategies to sort of move it beyond the descriptive scenario to make it more impactful and potentially practice changing?
So I think I actually don't necessarily agree with that it's descriptive. I think that it can be it's hypothesis generating, although in many ways, if you do the science well, you can create the near equivalent of a randomized trial. And we talked a little bit about that in my last talk when we talked about natural history experiments. There are other techniques as well. I think it will never be considered the, quote, gold standard of a randomized trial. However, I think it's very important to see how randomized trials ultimately roll out into practice. And I think that that you can identify gaps, and these gaps can be addressed. And the fact that these got incorporated into the guidelines, I think, are important. When it comes right down to it, guidelines in most areas in medicine are not solely reliant on randomized clinical trials, because we don't have enough time and we don't have enough money to do randomized clinical trial for everything we want to provide guidance on. And so these are, I think, helpful and beneficial in how we demonstrate what's going on.
And I might just add a minute to that. I think one of the keys to that is rigor. And one of the efforts that we're undergoing in the department right now is how to help bring rigor to what has been called sort of our outcomes work. Matt is helping us lead a search for a PhD level partner scientist to help sort of elevate this component of the research work we do. I think over time we've been building block by building block, trying to develop a research infrastructure for a variety of the kinds of research that we want to do in this department, be it the basic science, translational work, device development, health services research, machine learning, the things that are coming our way. And we really didn't have as much of a foundation, I think, as you all have said that we have wanted to have in the department. So I think we're on the next steps to doing that. But I think just like with basic science research, the more rigor you bring into the process, the more meaningful the impact of what you do. And so I think that's where we can do better. And I think in the early stages of some of our health services research, it was pretty descriptive. The tradition of sort of writing up the last 150 cases that you did, that sort of led, I'd say, a lot of our surgical work in the early days is giving way to higher quality, and really have appreciated your role in that and bringing and helping to bring more of that. As we get more of our trainees and our junior faculty involved in the master's programs that are available here at Davis, I think we help raise that bar as well. So, Matt, thank you again. Really appreciate it. Oh, yes.
I have one more question.
Sure.
First of all, thank you, because we have a lot of atypical, non-traditional residents here who have done many things, Wishy and Jeremy, just one or two. So thank you for this talk. It really hit home. And then also, as Dr. Farmer just mentioned, it's becoming more common practice to seek out master's degrees and advanced degrees throughout our training and in our career development years. Do you have any pearls of wisdom, or can speak to the nuances of then interacting with the experts in your field, with the PhDs and the rigorous training, when you speak your language but may speak their language but may not have their experience? I'd just love to hear some advice.
So I think I don't think I could have done what I did without the master's degree. So let's just start right there, because it really, the health economists and they have their own language, and this is the kind of work that health economists do that actually really do shape the way that the government and the country make decisions in terms of health policy. And so it was really extremely valuable to have that knowledge. And also, for better or worse, when you have additional training, it gives you, street credibility in terms of, how people critically look at your work. And so because all that training went into the work. I mean, there have been many projects where people have come to me, what do you think about doing this? I'm like, I don't think it's a very good idea because you're going to have problems based on your study design. So I think it leads to better work. It leads to better street credibility. It leads to better partnerships. It gives you a good, it gives you a way to talk with people, even if you don't understand, the depth that others do. And the fields are constantly moving and changing, and so I've been able to pick up on new, for example, statistical techniques because I had that great foundation as part of my training. And so it doesn't begin and end with the masters, but it really sort of just opens up doors. So obviously, I'm a strong advocate for it.
That speaking the language comment, I think, is very real, and I think some of your predecessors, who with an interest in global health, if you really want to be in that space, you need to be able to speak the language that those other folks are doing, and that's why we've encouraged folks to do that. Sometimes I had to laugh when you were talking about the health economics class with the undergraduates. There are pieces of it that you think, why do I have to do this? Now we've got some colleagues right now getting MBAs, and do I really need to know how to sell widgets, at Walmart or something? But there's some of that rite of passage that is part of all of our educational experiences, both in and outside of medicine. Matt, thank you again, really.
All right.